Hi, everybody. Welcome to Making the Grade. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. So nice to have you with us today. If you are joining us live here on Facebook, we'd love to hear your thoughts or comments as we discuss education in Idaho, not only the state of education, but education in the state and at the State House. Because joining me as always, Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Kevin, happy day 100 of the state legislature.
Yes, this is day 100, and as I've been joking around, I mean, is it like when you go to a basketball game and they tell you that if the home team scores 100, you get to take your ticket stub in, you get to get like a taco or a burger the next day? I wonder if we're at that stage of the session. We were day 100, even when you do have to factor in that we had that recess because of COVID-19. This is only the third time that the Idaho legislature has been in session for 100 days. The longest session was 118 days. We're getting there. I mean, and there are so many issues that are unresolved that I think the session's going to go on probably for another couple of weeks.
Well, and let's get right to it. I mean, the biggest issue not solved is the budget. I mean, the education budgets are still in limbo. You and I were talking last week that JFAC was going to have to rewrite the budgets for not only K through 12, the public school system, but also the higher education budget is still in limbo. These are not small issues that have to make their way all the way through the committees and into the houses and get approved. But fact of the matter is that JFAC hasn't addressed these yet.
Right, these two budgets, $1.4 billion combined. JFAC has not met to rewrite either of those budgets. Just in the past couple of minutes, another budget was sent back to the committee to rewrite. It's the smallest budget that JFAC has to do. It's the lieutenant governor's budget, but that's been a political firestorm in and of itself. So there's a lot of work still that has to be done in the budget committee. And you're right, these two budgets, the higher ed budget and the teacher salary budget, once JFAC writes them up, they have to go through both houses. And, you know, as we saw on the House floor, both the higher ed budget and the teacher salary budget died on the House floor. You know, that's why we're a long way to go. And to kind of, you know, put this all into perspective about why this session is going on so long and why it's going to go on probably for, you know, at least a couple of weeks longer, the Senate has made it pretty clear that they don't want to take up things like tax policy or transportation funding until they have a pretty good idea of what the budgets look like, because they want to figure out how much money they can exactly put into tax relief or transportation. So it's this whole big log jam of big issues that the legislature wants to try to address before they finally do adjourn this session. And it really does kind of begin with the budgets. And that really kind of begins with the education budgets.
Kevin, what we're talking about here, though, really has nothing to do with money. The debate has not been over how much money a budget is getting. There's a much larger issue at stake here that has nothing to do with the money.
Yes and no. I mean, I think especially on the teacher salary budget, it was such a strange debate last week because really, I didn't hear any legislators saying putting $1.1 billion into the teacher salary pool and funding another year of the teacher career ladder. Nobody was saying that's a bad idea. Nobody was saying we don't have the money for it. I mean, the state's sitting on a $600 million surplus. So, you know, the money is clearly there. And I think there's still the political sentiment there to fund teacher salaries. The whole debate was about, well, what's happening in the classroom in terms of you know, critical race theory and social justice being addressed in the classrooms. And can we put language into this budget bill that would prevent that from happening? Even though legislators really have not offered up many specifics about it actually happening. That's what the debate is about, especially on the teacher salary budget. So I think once JFAC gets back to work, once JFAC writes up a new teacher salary budget, I don't expect the figures to be all that much different. I don't expect there to be a move to cut that budget. It's really not about the dollar figure when we're talking about teacher salaries. Now, I think with higher education, it's a little bit different matter. I think you got legislators on that committee and legislators, especially in the House, who would like to cut the higher education budget. Now, how much that budget might get cut and whether those cuts would survive both the House and the Senate, that all remains to be seen. But I think there's more of a sentiment to take some money out of higher education. So I think it's a little bit different process between these two budgets.
Let's talk about the piece that you posted where you were discussing the state's top leaders, that being Governor Brad Little, and when it comes to education, the state superintendent, Sherry Ibarra, and the message that they are giving during this massive debate over social justice in the classroom and it being tied to the budgets and people being upset over language that's in there or not in there. Where do the governor and state superintendent come down on all of this?
Well, as far as the governor is concerned, I think that's a really good question. I wanted to interview the governor last week to get a sense of what he makes of these budgets being killed. But more broadly, I wanted to get a sense from him. Does he think that there's a social justice problem in Idaho schools? That was the basic question I have for him. Did not get an interview. The governor's office said that, he'll talk basically at the end of the session, which means he'll talk after this whole thing is resolved. Now, I know the governor and his staff are involved in this, behind the scenes discussion. I mean, that's part of the process. But I think it's a really open question as to whether he subscribes to the narrative that we're hearing at the State House, that this is a problem in K-12, it's a problem in higher education, and it has to be addressed in this budgeting process. Superintendent Ibarra, a little bit different situation. Again, she declined an interview request as well and issued a statement where she essentially said that she does not believe that this is going on in the public schools. She doesn't believe that you have instruction going on in the classroom that runs counter to Idaho values, but that she's comfortable with the legislature addressing this and kind of codifying what's already happening, which is to say that it just kind of formalizes and makes clear that this is not happening in the schools. So essentially, she's deferring to the legislature on this, and possibly she's kind of cutting herself out of the process of what this will look like in terms of whether we have a bill that addresses social justice or critical race theory, or in essence, she has taken the position of that she can live with language from the legislature addressing this issue when we don't really know what that language is going to look like.
I was going to say the House Education Committee was supposed to take up a bill this morning that possibly started to address the language behind this issue, but it didn't happen.
Right. So
that bill die?
It's dead, and there'll be a new version. We don't know when. So what happened on Monday was a version of a bill came out, was introduced, that would address sectarianism in the schools and discussion of sectarianism in the schools. And the crux of the debate was about language within that bill that would have essentially made it impossible for teachers or professors to discuss sectarian books or works that advanced sectarianism. And there was a real concern, even in the committee, it was a very short committee hearing, but there was a real concern that was raised about, well, are you muzzling teachers and professors and making it impossible for them to address sectarianism in any form, even to tell students, here is a work that has been debunked that discussed sectarianism. Now, that bill was introduced on Monday on a party line vote. It was supposed to go before the House Education Committee this morning, Tuesday morning. That hearing was canceled abruptly. I mean, House Education met, they honored the student page, but they did not discuss the sectarianism bill because the sponsors decided to pull it. They're supposedly working on a new version of the bill. As we speak here at 11:13 on Tuesday morning, there's no hearing scheduled for a new bill. We're watching the calendars and we're watching my phones for any updates to see what's happening on that. That's a big moving part right now. And if that's the vehicle that legislators want to use to address social justice, to address critical race theory, that bill is a key component for a lot of legislators. And I think that's the reason why right now education budgeting is at a total standstill. We talked about JFAC. We talked about how JFAC has not taken up the higher ed budget or taken up the teacher salary budget. You have several K-12 budget bills, and you have that early education grant bill that have been sitting on the House third reading calendar, which means that the House could take them up and vote on them at any time. The House has been skipping over those budget bills for several days. So pretty much anything budget related right now with education is at a grinding halt, and really does center on this whole social justice debate that's going on.
Kevin, as we have watched the legislature deal with specifically the K-12 budget over the last couple of years, it's sailed through. There has been literally, it's been up, down, done in a day sometimes. I mean, it just gets done. So are the waters so muddied right now by this debate over language that that's what's going to cause the legislature to go on for another 14 days?
Yeah, I think so. I think you've got legislators right now who want to get this issue addressed in some manner this session. And until it's addressed in some manner this session that they find satisfactory, I don't think we're going to see movement on these budgets until that language is in place. Now, whether that language shows up in a rewritten budget bill or if it becomes standalone legislation, there's been debate within the legislature about how to do this, or how to skin this cat. But you got legislators who really want this addressed in some manner, and I think there's kind of a critical mass on that. So until you get some sort of agreement, until you get some sort of a common ground about where legislators want to see the language, I don't think you're going to see the budgets move. And again, it's really not, especially with the K-12, it's really not about the dollar figure.
How does the language debate trickle down to my kid in the classroom? So if there's some language written into a budget bill that then gets passed into law, how does that affect curriculum that is decided at the local level?
Well, I think it affects curriculum, but I think what it also affects, to your question, and it's a great question, is how does it affect what teachers do in the moment, on the ground, in a classroom, when you're 25, 30 kids who may ask a question about race, who may ask a question about slavery, they may ask a question about Martin Luther King Jr. They may ask a question, and I think students are probably asking these questions right now in classrooms as we speak. They may ask a question about the trial and the pending verdict that we'll see coming out of Minnesota. How do you address those topics? How do you address current events? How do you address issues of race and gender? And those run the gamut. I mean, from history to current events. So how do teachers feel like they can broach those topics in the moment when you have a kid in class raise his or her hand and say, what about this? Can you talk a little bit about this? How does the teacher respond to that and remain compliant with the language that comes from the legislature? That's why this debate is so important. That's why groups like the School Boards Association are watching the language really, really closely, and why it's also significant that you had Superintendent Ibarra basically say, I'll go along with what the legislature comes up with in terms of language, sight unseen, in effect. Again,
when we're doing kind of a politics lesson when it comes to who has control of what portion of the education pieces that our children are dealing with here. I mean, obviously the legislature has the ability to set the academic standards. That's what, they have to, each school district has to meet X, Y, and Z because it's in an English standard or a math standard or a science standard in order to be teaching these types of things. What gets me here, Kevin, is that I don't remember, and maybe you have much more history on this than I do, but to go through the budgeting process and have this sort of standard language, academic standard language, somehow being put into a budget is just really eye-opening to me.
And I think what the legislature is doing is they're kind of pressing their prerogative as the branch of government that eventually, passes budget bills, that eventually appropriates, $4 billion of tax money, not just to education, but to all state agencies. I mean, with that power of budgeting also comes the power to be able to write, intent language is the term that is used at the State House, language that makes clear where legislators want to see that money spent or not spent. So you're really pushing the envelope of what legislators have the power to regulate or to mandate.
This is interesting to me too, because if everybody's been watching Making the Grade over the last, now months, I was thinking, when was January? It was a while ago, since we're still talking State House stuff towards the end of April. But we always said, Kevin, you and I, as we were going to be watching the legislature, that the division of power and how power would shape itself after the pandemic was going to be front and center in this legislature. And certainly it was. The emergency powers bill that got vetoed by the governor, that he came out and said, no, that does not give enough power to the governor to do what he needs to do in an emergency situation. So first major veto of the session there. But this continues to be somewhat, right, a power struggle over, and now we're talking about intent language when it comes to the schools. I think it's fascinating to watch how these power struggles have made their way around the State House in the last couple of months.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this has been a session where legislators have really tried to flex their muscles and try to, exert their will in a lot of areas of government. And separation of powers issue, the emergency powers issue has been a prime example of that, but certainly not the only example, as we're seeing with the education budgets. This is a legislature that has, depending on your point of view, they're either asserting their authority or they're meddling. I mean, that's the criticism that a lot of folks have leveled against this legislature.
Well, let's move to the higher ed budget, which again still needs to be now rewritten.
We don't know what it's going to look like.
Still needs to be written by JFAC. But I want to go to what happened last week, which was that the State Board of Education decided, even without a higher education budget, that they would freeze tuition again for undergraduate students at Idaho's colleges and universities next year. They all did this, but it wasn't an easy decision for them. And I kind of want to get a feel from you, Kevin, of how come they decided to do this now before they even had a budget in place?
Well, I think the State Board, the official line from the State Board is, that they wanted to give the colleges and universities some direction about, how to proceed this spring as you're recruiting students, as you're trying to get students to enroll for the fall. But I think, too, there's an element of politics to this, obviously. I think by freezing tuition, by agreeing to freeze tuition, the State Board and the university presidents, the college and university presidents, are sending a message that they want to try to hold the line and really continue to address access and affordability. So I think there's an element of politics to this. It's sort of a message to the legislature of, look, we're going to figure out a way to fund higher education, not knowing exactly what we're getting from the state, but not putting it on the backs of Idaho students and their parents. So, the timing was definitely deliberate. And, what you heard last week from the State Board and from the colleges and university presidents is this is not going to be easy. Depending on what happens with the legislature, depending on what happens with the higher education budget, you're going to see programs and staff positions that may have to be cut to make all of this work. But Kevin Satterlee, the president of Idaho State University, made an interesting point, and it ties into a project that I'm working on higher education enrollment. He said, we lost students this year. We had students who wanted to come, didn't come. I want to get them back. I want to get them on campus after this gap year, and I want them to show up this fall. And I can't recruit them. I can't bring them back as easily if I'm also passing on a tuition or fee increase to them. So, I think the colleges and university presidents recognizing that this is going to be a difficult decision, also saying, look, it's the only choice we have. It's the right choice for us to make if we're trying to get students back onto campus or keep students on campus.
Kevin, you said the timing of this decision had some politics behind it, perhaps. And you say that because the state board was already set to meet this week, correct? For some of the
not that would have made much difference because you'd still have a higher education budget in limbo. But yeah, the state board is meeting this week. They're talking about, among other things, they're talking about free speech issues on the colleges, on the campuses. But certainly the state board could have taken up the tuition and fee issue this week during their regularly scheduled board meeting. They put a meeting together just to talk about tuition and fees. It was about a 40-minute meeting, but they wanted to go on record, make the decision, make their position clear last week as the debate over the higher education budget continues to unfold, really mostly behind the scenes right now at the State House.
And yet again, you can bring this into the power struggle as well. You've got a state board of education who is appointed by the governor. So I'm going to be fascinated when the session finally gets done and maybe some people will actually speak out in ways that we understand the inner workings of what was really going on underneath the Capitol.
Yeah. And, when we finally sort out all of the moving parts that we have going on, these budget bills that we've talked about, these various pieces of legislation dealing with social justice or free speech on campus. You had the House passed a bill pretty much on a party line vote. It was pretty close to a party line on Friday, dealing with free expression on the colleges, on the college campuses. That bill passed the House. It hasn't moved over in the Senate yet, but it's only been a couple of days. That's another ingredient in this whole mix as the legislature tries to sort out all these issues and come up with something that everybody can, not everybody, there's not going to be unanimity here, but come up with some sort of formula that enables them to pass budgets and go home.
Before I let you go, Kev, let's just do a quick, in case people are joining us and they're curious, because we like to do this here on Making the Grade, is take a look at the numbers that Idaho Ed News continues to track when it comes to COVID-19. And, if we want to start in the K-12 system, kids for the most part all across the state are back in classrooms in one form or another. Many of the large school districts going back essentially full time into the classrooms. And coronavirus cases pretty steady is what you're finding, correct?
Yeah, there's not been a whole lot of change in that bar chart that you're looking at. I mean, we're looking at about 100 new cases a week in the K-12 system. And, here we are, we're, a few months out from when teachers and staff could get the vaccine. And, we're a few weeks away from the end of the school year. So those numbers have held pretty steady. And, the big figure that I'm looking at right now was the one that, we put together from our piece on Friday, our weekly piece that looks at statewide trends. New case numbers for that week ending Friday. It was about the lowest number of new cases we've seen in about 10 months. So you're going back to, last summer. So the new case numbers have started to taper off. And obviously you're seeing more and more people getting vaccinated. I'd also point out, I spoke to Dr. Dave DePate, the retired CEO from the St. Luke's Health System. He was on my podcast last week, and I wanted to ask him about those case numbers, about those trends, and what does it mean in terms of schools being open and staying open. And, he said that, for now, as long as schools can maintain social distancing, he believes that schools can continue to operate and can operate safely. What his take on these numbers right now, his take is, we've held off. We haven't seen that big surge that you're seeing in other states because of the new variants of the virus. What he wants to see happen now is, the state step up and continue to get more people vaccinated and continue to drive those vaccination numbers upward, because that would buy the state some time and could potentially ward off that kind of a surge due to the variants. So, his message was, if you haven't gotten vaccinated yet, everybody's eligible right now. I mean, all adults are eligible, I should say. If you haven't gotten a vaccine yet, his counsel is, go get it.
Yes, if you're 16 and older, you can get the vaccine in Idaho right now, and it's easy to get. I mean, there are appointments open daily at, you name it, the healthcare systems. Walk down to your local pharmacy, you can probably get it there.
And not to age myself, I am 16 or older, and I got my second round of vaccine on Friday. So I'm looking forward to being fully vaccinated here in the next few days.
Well, and let's quickly take a look at college campuses too. When it comes to COVID-19 numbers, how's everybody doing at that level? Because again, everybody can get vaccinated.
Again, I think the numbers are pretty stable. I mean, several colleges and universities reported another round of drop-offs. The big one that kind of struck me, just because of what's been happening in that part of the state this spring, Brigham University of Idaho in Rexburg, big drop-off in cases. They only had a couple of new cases on campus last week. After we saw spikes in case numbers in that area in Madison County, across most of eastern Idaho. So numbers right now on the campuses looking fairly steady to stable and dropping on several campuses.
Kevin, there's a comment here from Karen that I'd like to show you. We really love it when people comment and join us here on Making the Grade. She's going back to our discussion regarding the social justice debate and probably higher education, specifically free speech on college campuses, and saying the legislature will scare off Idaho's brightest students from Idaho schools by censoring what's taught. And that comment I thought was really interesting in light of the tuition freezes that the university presidents are pushing for as well, because are they worried about content and what they're going to have the ability to teach on college campuses here in Idaho? And maybe some of Idaho's students will choose not to stay in the state because they want a broader education?
I think those worries have to kind of intersect at some point. I think colleges and universities Idaho colleges and universities are struggling to get in-state students as it is. That was the big point that we saw in the past year with the pandemic. It wasn't that the Idaho schools actually did a pretty good job of bringing in students from out of state, partly because out-of-state students were looking at Idaho as a place where they could get face-to-face instruction. Where Idaho saw a drop-off in enrollment was students in-state. Now, a lot of those students, those in-state students who didn't show up, are sitting out the year. That's kind of BSU's research right now indicates that the students who were going to go to Boise State from elsewhere in Idaho just stayed home. They just are sitting it out for the first year of, for this year to see where things go. But to your point, and to Karen's point in her comment, will Idaho students look at Idaho colleges and say, this is, I could get a better education, I could get a more well-rounded education going out of state, even if it costs quite a bit more? That's a fair concern. And the big picture of this, when students leave a state and go and get a college education elsewhere, there's an increased possibility that those students never come back to their home state. They move on and they don't come back. So that's in the big picture, that's got to be a consideration right now.
Karen, I appreciate that comment. We'll be listening when the state board meets later this week. I'd be just curious to see if the idea, as they discuss free speech on college campuses, and of course, what's happening in the legislature with intent language going into budget bills, I'm going to be very curious to hear if the State Board of Education brings up any kind of topic like this when they're trying desperately to keep Idaho students in Idaho and going to Idaho schools.
Right.
Really good. Kevin, anything else?
Anything else? No, I think we will continue. watch us all week. We will continue to cover the latest at the legislature, and we'll cover that state board meeting. So we'll be busy these next couple of days, and we will be busy for however much longer the legislature goes on. I expect it will probably, again, I think it's going to be a couple more weeks.
Well, I certainly wish I had a free 100 taco day coupon for you, my friend, but I don't. So
I may have to spring for my own taco, I guess. That's fine.
In Idaho, that would be, an Idaho potato coupon for some French fries or something. I'm not sure. Everybody,
celebrate day 100 as you wish, or don't celebrate it. I mean.
Thank you again for being with us, for making the grade. As Kevin said, idahoednews.org, definitely the place to go to look at all of these stories, look at the up-close numbers if you're interested in what's happening on campuses, K-12 or the college campuses with coronavirus. And there's so many other really good stories that the education team at Idaho Ed News puts out every single day that Kevin and I can't even talk about. So grab the app, download it, get on Idaho Ed News, and enjoy the good work by the people there.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here, for making the grade.
Thanks. Have a good week, Michelle.